That resonates. I guess it makes me wonder then about the other point, which is one of the things that I came to think might be true after writing Think Again is, okay, we should all try to think more like scientists, right? Don't let our ideas become our identities. Treat our opinions as hunches or hypotheses to test. Run experiments in our own lives to find out why we might be wrong. But it seems like there are certain advantages of talking like a preacher or a prosecutor in order to get heard and be persuasive. And I tried to make the case in the book that that may work if the audience is already open or receptive, but that if they're defensive or resistant, that you actually want to talk more scientifically. And I was wondering what you made of that argument and whether you think I might have missed the mark.
No, I think that it makes perfect sense. The challenge is knowing which audience you're addressing, right? And I think there are audiences who are wanting to be motivated. They want that. It's the locker room speech by the coach at halftime or whatever. It's Winston Churchill, we'll fight them on the beaches, or whatever it is. They're hesitant, but they're willing to be persuaded, and they want to be galvanized. And then there are people who are already digging their heels in, and when they sense that someone is trying to push them, they just fight back. By the way, there is an interesting parallel. There's some research on graphs, whether graphs persuade people versus presenting data in tables. And my recollection of the research is that graphs are great if people don't have preconceived ideas. People love graphs. But if people are already resistant to the idea, showing them a pretty picture doesn't help at all. If anything, it just sort of gets their hackles up even further.
That's fascinating. It reminds me of some Google engineers who said they were immediately suspicious of anything that was ever shown on PowerPoint because it was too slick and it was too simplified. They're like, show me your raw data. I want to go through all the rows and columns and see whether I can reproduce your analysis, which I think is a degree of skepticism a scientist would welcome.
Yeah, it's intriguing. It is intriguing. I've been thinking about data visualization a lot because we've got a cautionary tales coming about Florence Nightingale, the world's great data visualization expert, and we managed to persuade Helena Bonham Carter to play Florence Nightingale, and she's actually a distant cousin of Florence Nightingale. So I'm super into the data visualization space right now. I think
I can't wait to hear this episode.
It's going to be cool. It's going to be cool. Because oh goodness me, I'm sorry. Let me look at my watch and realize it's time to take questions. I was going to ask you a question about cognitive entrenchment. I was going to ask you a question about expertise and the Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm not going to ask you any of those questions. Instead, Adam, I'm going to pick up my phone because questions have been incoming on WhatsApp, and okay.
Or we could rethink the flow of the event and make sure we get to your questions at the end if there's time.
We could try that. I got one or two questions.
I'm happy to hang around for a few extra minutes if you are.
Yeah, thank you. I want to talk about podcasts and I want to talk about vaccine hesitancy. So let's try and remember that. Okay, so we've got questions coming in about debate. So a question from Simon. Debate. Doesn't debate favor the middle-aged white guy? You've got a specific set of skills that are taught in specific educational settings where privileged white men gather. I suppose in a way that's an attack on what I was saying, which is that everyone's equal in the debate. But I mean, let's broaden that out. Are there certain rules of engagement that we can adopt that favor different groups, or that we might want to adopt in order to bring out different voices?
Oh, that's interesting. I think, in a debate, yeah, I would worry that I grew up in a middle-class Midwest US town. I don't remember ever being invited to join a debate team, even as a white guy, right? So yeah, my image of debate is, sort of upper-class privileged kids getting to argue about, things that may not matter while the world burns. So I think obviously opening up access and making sure that kids have the opportunity to learn to disagree, to learn to argue, which by the way is my favorite thing about debate, right? That kids actually get comfortable saying, you know what, I can have a decent conversation with somebody who does not hold the same opinions that I do on everything. And I can maybe even try on somebody else's arguments and make them convincingly as a way of practicing flexibility. I think though that where a lot of debate that I see in my day job is in meetings. And I think that too many meetings are dominated by the same voices, either the person with the most power, the biggest extrovert in the room, the white man with a lot of confidence, not really asking who's competent. And one of the experiments that I would love to see more people running right now is, in your next Zoom meeting, what if you just rotated who leads the meeting? Right? There's no reason why we can't try that. It's a chance for other people to develop leadership skills. It's a chance to hear different voices. It's an opportunity to shift some of your norms. And one of the things that I've been doing with a bunch of teams that I've been working with is just saying, you know what, as a leader, it's fine if you want to frame the discussion or highlight what the issue is that you want to discuss, but why don't you speak last? Why don't you go around the room and hear every other person talk first? And that way we're going to get that equalization of voice. And I think that's something we should all be testing out.
Is there a risk to asking the leader to, I like the idea and I approve in principle, but the little part of my spidey sense says, now you're in this weird Stalinist world where everybody is trying to guess what the boss is going to say, and no one's actually going to say anything at all. I suppose if your corporate culture is that toxic, then you've got bigger problems.
I think you just answered your own question.
Yeah, I think I did. So let me ask you a better question from Anon, which is an interesting name. But Anon asks, if you could think again, what would be different compared to when you wrote it?
I mean, there's a lot, because I turned in the book over the summer and finished the copy edits in the fall. So I've had plenty of time to rethink. I've also been getting lots of reader feedback and having so many fun conversations like this. I think one thing that I am rethinking now that I really was not even on my radar when I wrote the book is, what's the best alternative to thinking like a preacher, a prosecutor, and a politician if you want to be open-minded? And I thought when I wrote the book that scientist was the way to go, because the scientific method has, I think, been responsible for much of the most important rethinking in the last, at least, I would say a few hundred years, right? If we think about evidence-based medicine and all of the things we've been able to learn from actually accumulating knowledge with scientific tools. But I've been persuaded, as I've talked to different people, that sometimes the formality of the scientific method is something that people think is out of reach for them. They think, you know what, I don't have a microscope or a telescope. I don't have a lab. I don't do experiments. And so I've been thinking, okay, do you want to think like a scholar? Is that the goal, right? Where your motivation is to learn, not to be right. Where your motivation is to seek the truth, not to believe you've already found it. I've even thought sometimes that what you want to be is maybe thinking more like an artist. And I guess there was a little hint of this in, chapter 9, when I wrote about how sometimes, maybe it was chapter 8, that sometimes the emotions we feel are rough drafts. And that instead of framing them, right, we should do what artists do, which is to say, all right, let me rethink this and then revise accordingly. And I think I would, if I were going to rewrite Think Again, I might try on more mental models in addition to scientists, as opposed to preaching, prosecuting, and politicking.
That suggests, I mean, there is a certain torture in writing a book, which is that you write it and then you go through this process of editing, which at first is fun, and then the copy edits are just, I wouldn't wish copy edits on my worst enemy. And then, it all goes quiet, and then you have to start talking about the book, by which time you're probably already thinking about your next book. And you talk about it until you've said everything you can possibly say about the book, and then you have to start publicizing the paperback. I mean, I'm presenting it in a very negative light, and actually, I love writing. I've written 9 books. I love writing books, so I shouldn't complain. But there is a certain, you talk about sort of cognitive entrenchment. There's an entrenchment of your ideas in this book. You set them, you planned them, I don't know, 3 years ago. You drafted it a year ago. You finished all the edits 6 months ago. And you're already thinking about stuff that you wish could be different. A book's the wrong format. And should it all be talks? Should it all be podcasts? Is there a better way to get your ideas across that allows more updating and editing as you go along?
I'm gonna give you another both and reaction here, Tim, which is I don't think books are the wrong format at all. I think they're the best possible format for doing deep thinking. The quality of my thought when I'm writing a book is, it's sharper, it's more systematic, it's clearer than any other thinking that I do, because I have to wrestle with a big question or topic. I have to build a framework around it. And then I'm trying to build a forest where I know what the forest is before I planted all the trees. And I think that just requires, it forces a level of discipline to really make sense of the thing that you're trying to understand in a way that I've never had to do when giving a talk, right? Because it's easy to get away with a little bit of fuzziness by telling a captivating story or making some entertaining jokes. In a podcast, right, you get the dynamism of the back and forth. And so I don't have to have worked out that much yet because I'm going to learn during the conversation. Whereas to produce the book, I have to have figured something out, right? So to me, the book is the beginning of conversations. It's not the end of them. I think it's such a privilege to have a chance to share ideas that I love and for them to keep on evolving. Last time I checked, that's called learning, right? Yeah. And that's part of the fun of doing this. But I think you hit on something really powerful, which is there's a part of me that wishes that as soon as I finished a draft of the book, I could then go on book tour. And then I could do all the revising and rethinking before I turn it in. And sadly, publishers don't work that way, but how much better would our books be if they did?
No, it's really true. I won't name the author because it's unfair, but I remember once seeing a talk by an economist about some really interesting ideas that he'd written a book about. And it was such a good talk. It was so compelling. The ideas were so original and just, I thought, this is amazing. I got to get this guy's book. And I got the book, and the book was sort of wooden, and the ideas were not very well worked out. And I realized the guy wrote the book, and after he'd finished writing the book, he figured out what he really wanted to say. And I think it was particularly extreme in that case, but I think all authors have that experience of, it's only when you get out there that you realize, oh, hang on, there's a cleverer, more concise, more appropriate way of doing it. I wanted to ask Adam, and I'm going to apologize in advance for the question, because if you were British, you would, at this point, tear off the microphone and storm out. But because you're American, I think you'll tolerate the question. So your books are, if you don't mind me saying so, very good. Your TED Talks are very good. Right. Your podcast your WorkLife is fantastic. It's great. Apparently you keep winning these awards for your academic teaching. I'm not qualified to judge your skill as an academic. You seem to be doing fine. So is this basically the same skill that you've developed, that you've managed to figure out how to deploy in all of these different formats? Or are you in fact just good at everything and it's kind of annoying?
I wish the latter was true. It would be so much more fun. Actually, it'd probably be boring, but it sounds fun. No, I mean, I have a long list of things that I'm terrible at. And my wife will be the first to tell you that she signed me up for dancing lessons before we got married. And I was so bad that she quit, and she made me quit too on the second one.
That's painful. That's painful.
I have no rhythm. I also am completely incapable of finding my way anywhere. My in-laws actually have a name for this. It's called an Adam turn. And it's when I'm driving my car and I realize only about 10 kilometers down the road that I'm going the wrong way and then have to turn around. And I've even done this within just a few kilometers of my own house. So no sense of direction. I can give you a long list of sports I failed at. The Michelangelo class that I took in college, where I literally could not stay awake. I was so bored by the idea of art history.
You're answering like a Brit now. You're giving me a list of your weaknesses, but a serious question: do you think that the podcast, the talks, the teaching, the books, are they basically the same skill, or are you actually perfecting different skills in these different mediums?
I think that there are some common skills and some different skills. So I think the common ones are loving ideas, being obsessively focused on a project or a task until it's done, and wanting to. I think one of my biggest limitations as a researcher has been, I don't think my ideas are very original. I think my first instinct is always when I have a question to go and accumulate everything that's ever been known about that question. And for a long time, I thought that meant that I was never going to contribute to the field. And what I've realized now is, well, there's a different creative skill, right? It's not the same novelty or eureka moment, but there's a different creative skill in synthesizing all those different perspectives and creating a framework to organize them. And I think that's something that I do comparatively well, and it's something I try to bring to all the different media. I think though that the biggest difference across these is, I don't know. I feel like it's easy to be an effective author and also an effective teacher and speaker as a human jukebox, right? Where you have some go-to stories and data points, and you're good at regurgitating those when people say, give me your greatest hit. And podcasting has zero tolerance for that set of tendencies, right? And it's what I love most about podcasting is it's an excuse for me to go out into the world and learn and say, who are the people, what are the places that I think can teach me something? And that way I get to be learning with the listener as opposed to, just doing all the teaching to the listener. I'm curious to hear your take on this, because I don't want to, I wrote in the book about blowing smoke up your arse as a strange phrase, but I don't believe in doing that. And Tim, part of the reason I was so thrilled to have this conversation with you is every time I read your work, every time I listen to you speak, I think, wow, Tim is brilliant. And I wish I got to spend more time with him, because I learned so much from not just the knowledge he collects, but also the way he thinks. And so I'm curious, you've written extraordinary books. You have a great column. Your podcast is my favorite thing to do when I'm in the car. What do you see as the similarities and differences?
I think you're onto something. Thank you, by the way. You're very, very, very kind, but I'm British, so I have to ignore all that. I think you're absolutely right about the podcast forcing you to find new stories and new ideas. A book contains a lot of good stories potentially and a lot of good ideas potentially if it's a good book, but they tend to get boiled down over time. So for some reason, I was actually reading a book just this morning that I wrote in 2011 called Adapt. And I realized I'd forgotten almost all of the stuff in it. I didn't realize I'd written that. That's interesting. Oh, it's interesting to make those two connections. So, but there are a couple of stories I remember very clearly from that book. So I think there is something very refreshing about doing, WorkLife in your case, or Cautionary Tales in my case, that says, okay, fine, you've done that story. That's this week. What about next week? What's the next lesson? So that's great. I personally prefer speaking to writing. And I love all of it, but if you said I only had to do one, give me that red circle and put the spotlight on it. Yeah.
Why?
Because I'm extremely shy, and you are never better protected from other people than if you're on the TED stage, when you're in that circle, no one's going to bother you. You've got 18 minutes of blissful solitude. I love it. So
that's so fascinating. I would have guessed the opposite, I guess in part because my preference is the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
There is no substitute for when you make a real connection with the audience. I love that feeling. I think it's the closest people like us ever get to knowing what it's like to be a musician in a rock band.
Yeah.
But I would choose writing any day because I think I'll get closer to the truth that way. And I also think that at least human history so far has a longer shelf life on books than it does talks.
Yes, you could be right. You could be right. Anyway, the great thing is we don't need to choose. We both have wonderful lives. We're very, very lucky. And we're talking to each other about each other, and I should be asking you these questions. So I'm going to look back at this with apologies to everyone who's sending in their great questions, because I derailed that. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. I will say I'm going to try to do lightning style answers so we can get through a bunch of questions.
Okay, so I've got one for another anonymous question. Maybe this links to vaccines. I don't know. It's up to you. What role does empathy have in productive rethinking?